He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
Very nice. Today we celebrate Christ's resurrection, our Savior's triumphant victory over death. Today is the celebration after the grief, the sunrise after a darkest night, a rainbow after a terrifying storm. Today, though the weather outside may do as it may, we are a radiant church, excited to share this good news with the world. Life wins. We know that Mary Magdalene is the first to encounter the tomb empty, but she does not come to understand the unfolding events until Jesus, a supposed gardener, speaks her name. She first encounters an empty tomb, and then she runs. She runs to get Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, and then returns with them to the tomb, though still she does not go in. She discovers the joy of the resurrection when that humble gardener speaks her name, Mary. When this happens, she knows him to be Jesus. She weeps and speaks a word of recognition and thanksgiving. But for me, on this particular Easter morning, I am most intrigued by Simon Peter and the other, the beloved disciple, and their journey to understanding the resurrection. You see, they come to know the unfolding events in a very different way. Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, these were the only two, according to John's Gospel, who entered the tomb and understood the resurrection. Even though the beloved disciple saw the empty linen wrappings from outside the tomb at first, it wasn't until he actually went inside the tomb that he believed. And then having believed, the disciples went home. From outside the tomb, it is difficult to understand the resurrection in its entirety. Though the disciples had read the scriptures, though they had heard Jesus tell them that he would die, only to resurrect on the third day, though they believed Jesus was God's only Son, still they did not understand the resurrection from outside the tomb. Only upon entering that tomb, only upon entering that dark, dank pit in the earth, smelling of death and silence, only then did the weight of the resurrection settle upon the disciples. This is a clue for us this morning. For we who seek to understand God's promises and to understand our own implicated selves in God's story and to seek clarity. It is unsettling to hear the story from John this morning, not because it speaks of God's resurrection, but instead because it still speaks of death. It's Easter morning, after all, and we are supposed to be done with death and everything sad. Well, according to our gospel reading today, the sad and disturbing parts of life continue despite the good news we hear and inherit in our baptisms. In order to understand God's greatest gift, resurrection in life, we must first stand in the tomb and believe. We must encounter the darkest, dankest, and emptiest places that mortal life has to offer. This is our lot as human beings. We are broken, limited, fragile, ill-informed, wandering, and unsure of ourselves. Many of us bear burdens of this world on our bodies, in our minds, and even upon our spirits. We may be burdened by domestic violence, behavioral or chemical dependency, depression and mental illness, love lost or broken, unemployment, physical insecurity, physical ailment and disease, and grief in the face of death and loss. When we leave this sanctuary place this morning, and when we return to work and school after the Easter celebrations conclude, these heavy weights will not disappear. The brokenness does not end this morning. We will continue to step in and out of these tombs our whole life long. But take heart. God does not abandon you to a dank, dark tomb. God does not abandon you to the fragility and mortality of a human life. We live much as the disciples lived, constantly questioning and discerning, doing our best though usually falling short. Hindsight reveals our lack of sense, and yet through all of this we follow our Lord and our teacher, Jesus Christ. And just as the disciples finally stepped into the tomb and believed, so too will we fearlessly encounter the tombs of our own lives, and we will believe. If we are to understand the beauty, the impossibility, and the surprising promise of resurrection and life as those two disciples on that first Easter morning, we must step into the tomb. When you find yourself surrounded by darkness, unable to escape the chains of whatever ails you, know that God does not abandon you to a dark and dank tomb. Know that God will call you out of this brokenness. Know that silence and death are no longer your conclusion. Instead, the tomb is but the grief before the celebration, the darkest night before the sunrise, the terrifying storm before the beautiful rainbow. Easter morning is our reminder that resurrection and life, these are our lot. I pray that when in the midst of those darkest moments of your life that you feel God's presence and you feel God's promise. I pray that in the dank, dark tomb that you come to believe in your promised resurrection and life eternal. I pray that the God of the cross and the God of the empty tomb strengthen you and embrace you in this life, that you may take heart and persevere when you encounter brokenness. May the God above and the God in our midst sustain you. Amen.